Compromise of 1850. We're going to talk a little bit about the Compromise of 1850 and its impact on politics, economics, on society, on culture. I mean, the Compromise of 1850 can be considered a turning point because the men who designed this compromise believed that it would prevent civil war, that by appeasing both sides, America could work together in order to come to some agreement. And the three men responsible really for engineering this compromise were the two great Whig leaders of the Congress and the aging Democratic leader. I'd be talking about Henry Clay and Daniel Webster of the Whig Party and the aging John C. Calhoun, who would die before seeing the Compromise of 1850 passed. The fourth Democrat, or the fourth character who was involved in this compromise, would be a relatively unknown nationally, but growing in popularity within the Congress leader, Stephen Douglas. And Stephen Douglas, a 4'11" senator from Illinois, had been the fastest growing politician in America, served in state positions, served in national positions very quickly, and by his late 20s, he was already serving in the Congress. And between these four men, the compromise was passed. Now, the compromise was not a single vote. It was actually 5 separate bills that were passed. But they were all passed within the course of several months, so collectively they're known as the Compromise of 1850. The first of the bills involved California entering as a free state. At the end of the Mexican-American War, there was this discussion about what to do with California and New Mexico and the newly conquered territories, and it was decided that those territories should probably be given popular sovereignty so that people can decide within those territories should slavery exist. But the Whigs were not happy with all the territory being given over to popular sovereignty. So moderates like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster negotiated that California would enter as a free state and the other territories would be open to popular sovereignty. The slave trade was declared illegal in the District of Columbia. This was a concession to Whigs. Now, although slavery could still exist in Washington, seeing that we had presidents and congressmen and senators from around the country who were slaveholders, there could be no trade of slaves within the boundaries of the District of Columbia. Now, the international slave trade with Africa or with other foreign countries had been banned since the 1820s. But slavery still existed in trade, and it was a big actual economic enterprise for the states of Maryland and Delaware, because for the most part, since they were tobacco states, they required less slaves. So their extra slaves, they made it a commodity, and they sold to southern states like South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, who had much more intensive cotton labor, where they needed more slaves. But slave trade in the District of Columbia was declared illegal. In addition, a third bill created a settlement of the border of New Mexico, and Texas. Now, this was controversial because Texans had been fighting over their boundaries with Mexico prior to the Mexican-American War. And now, finally, after the war, Texas would know exactly where its borders were. It would know where to settle its people, and it would know the area it has authority over. Now, New Mexico, emerging as a new territory, was a nice hotbed for slavery sentiment. And with the right manipulation, Texas could have people move into the New Mexico territory, and through popular sovereignty, they could vote for slavery. But New Mexico was very sparsely populated, so the idea of having New Mexico become a state was hard for people to swallow because they had so few people. The other part of this bill also gave Texas $10 million, and the federal government decided to give this money to pay for debts that Texas incurred between its revolution and the Mexican-American War, where Texas had not been a stable economy because of these debts. And part of becoming part of the United States is that the United States incurs the debts of states, just like the states' debts were incurred by a national bank in the beginning of American history. Now, New Mexico and Utah, like I had said, were territories without restrictions, and they're in purple on this map. So these two territories were now open to popular sovereignty. So the belief or the idea was that although California entered as a free state, Utah and New Mexico would vote to become slave territories, thereby keeping the balance and actually giving the South a majority of states and slave territories. And then finally, the fifth part of the compromise was this new fugitive slave law. And the fugitive slave law was important to the South for two reasons. One, it required the federal government and the state governments to work together to aid slaveholders in bringing back property. So when before, states didn't really have to make an effort in order to help slaves that go back to their masters and could actually grant those slaves freedom within their boundaries. Now it was up to each state to forcibly bring those people to justice and allow slave catchers to roam the streets for bounty to bring African Americans to the South. The second reason why the South liked this policy is there was a way they could capture free African Americans living in the North. So they didn't have to pay for these slaves. And the reason why they could capture free African Americans was because African Americans were not citizens and therefore not granted equal trials. And therefore when they were arrested by these bounty hunters, they were not given an equal way of defending themselves to show they were not a slave. So in essence, many freed African Americans and free men, born free men, were captured during this period of time and brought to the South in shackles, sold into slavery. All in all, these 5 bills create the Compromise of 1850. They were not a perfect solution. They were definitely a compromise. They were created by moderates within the party. And in the end, they did help to avoid civil war. But the Civil War could not be avoided forever. The war was inevitable beginning in 1850 because slavery was still a problem, and although there was concessions made to both sides, the Whigs were not happy because slavery's future was still not decided. The Democrats were not happy because it was still not decided the federal government would stay out of the business of states where slavery had existed in the past. As a result, although this prolongs the Civil War for 10 years, it does create a continued sense of unbalance for both Democrats and Whigs.